So my name is Krista Lynes. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University. And the work I do is largely around the political force of media and different kinds of artistic interventions as well to enact social change. I'm recording this module as an unwitting settler colonial, racialized white, on the unceded land of the Ganyan-Gahaga Nation. What's occupied my thinking over a decade or more is a problem or a predicament, which is that there's a vulnerability both in being seen and in not being seen. And so I'm interested in what the limits and the powers are of images and how we might be held responsible for the vulnerability of members of our community who are persecuted on the basis of their race or their gender or their sexuality or their citizenship status. And so this topic is really thinking about what we do about images and footage of police violence in our contemporary moment. We're in late August 2020. We've just seen the traumatic footage of the shooting of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin, which follows on the heels of the killing of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Tony McDade. And so many of these instances of police violence are recorded by bystanders and loved ones in the community. And thank goodness, because justice is hard to come by in the best of times. But as media scholars, I think it's incumbent upon us to think about what the cost is of this footage circulating on social media and what responsibility we have if and when we watch it. So the question that occupies me as a media studies scholar is what it means for this footage to exist and what it means for us to watch this footage and what it means for us to watch as Black viewers, as non-Black people of color, and as white viewers. Questions that I ask are, what are the politics and the affective force of watching images of violence against Black and Indigenous and people of color or BIPOC bodies? What does this visibility do, and what can't it do? And as this slide makes clear, while I'm talking here about videos of police violence largely in the US context, and these are the images that have galvanized the movements for racial justice around the world, I really need to emphasize that police violence against BIPOC folks is rampant in Canada too. And while the politics of images is different here than in the US, the question of trauma and accountability and justice that I'm trying to raise here also applies to the Canadian context. And so I rely on these lists compiled on the one hand by Alia Chugtai and on the other hand by Desmond Cole, remembering Black on the one hand, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color on the other, killed by police in both the American and the Canadian context. And I'm thinking this in concert with the powerful work of the artist Carrie Mae Weems. She's an artist and a social activist whose work has always asked the viewer to confront the legacy of the slave trade, the erasure and the celebration of Black celebrity by white narratives of popular culture and police brutality today. And so this image that we begin with is a rephotographed, an enlarged, rare 19th and early 20th century photographs of enslaved people. And what she did is she etched into the glass that frames the image a series of phrases that were her thoughts about these images as a way of giving voice to subjects that historically had no voice. And so here, it's the title of an exhibit that she made that's "From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried." And it's a really potent and very powerful statement. From here I saw what happened and I cried. My point in starting with this is to foreground the political possibilities and the psychic costs to BIPOC folks of recording and viewing and sharing images of violence, and to undo the belief that these images necessarily or forcibly solicit humanitarian sentiments for white audiences. So I want to end by proposing new ways to watch this footage as allies to racial justice. To do this, I draw especially and indebted to Black scholarship, whose works I link in the shared resources. Elizabeth Alexander, Herman Gray, Saidiya Hartman, David Marriott, Ellen Scott, and others. I'm really indebted to their arguments and to their elucidations, which I'm going to draw on a lot in this paper today. So the first thing that I think I want to do is to contextualize the current moment and to really emphasize that the images that circulate today bear the trace of older galvanizing images that have really mobilized movements for Black lives, and that these same images have also risked consolidating and perpetuating racial violence. These are, of course, the photographs that circulated of Emmett Till's corpse following his brutal attack in Mississippi in 1955, and the video footage of Rodney King's beating by the police in Los Angeles in 1991. And I want to hold together these two statements that are here on this slide. The statement that Elizabeth Alexander makes, that these are epic and iconic instances of police violence and civilian violence and killing of Black people, and also that they are a medium of dissent, of remembrance, and intentional history. So a kind of both and argument, both a cost and a possibility, and that we have to hold these two things together, right? So first, Emmett Till, I don't need to rehearse this story, but of course, as many of you know, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old who was sent from Chicago to Money, Mississippi to spend 2 weeks of his summer vacation with his relatives. On the evening of August 24th, 1955, he bought a pack of bubblegum from Carolyn Bryant, the white wife of a shopkeeper. She accused Till of making advances at her. And we should, as a side note, emphasize that this is part of the way that white women have been complicit in violence against Black men at the time and still today. For this, Emmett Till was brutally murdered by Carolyn Bryant's husband and his half-brother. The all-white, all-male jury found the two brothers not guilty after little more than an hour of deliberations. And when Emmett Till's mother had to identify the mutilated corpse of her son, she made a choice, and that choice was to display her son's open casket at his funeral. And this picture of Till's body was printed in Jet magazine and in the Black press, a challenge that Mamie Till Bradley posed to people to view the violence and to behold in it the face of American racism. So many argue that this image of Till's corpse, which I'm not reproducing here, served as a political catalyst for Black Americans and for the civil rights movement. And this is what Mamie Till Bradley said about her choice and her decision. I knew that I could talk for the rest of my life about what had happened to my baby. I could explain it in great detail. I could describe what I saw laid out there on that slab at A.A. Rayner's, 1 piece, 1 inch, 1 body part at a time. I could do all of that and people still would not get the full impact. They would not be able to visualize what had happened unless they were allowed to see the results of what had happened. They had to see what I had seen. Let the world see what I've seen. Christine Harold and Kevin DeLuca write about the so-called shock waves produced by this image because of the forcefulness of an image of the human body in peril, but more poignantly, because of the ways in which Black communities in the US embraced this image and foregrounded this image, so that rather than having the image imposed upon them of violated Black bodies, for example, in lynching photographs or in postcards, as a symbol of unmitigated white power, this was reclaimed, right? Reclaimed by Black communities. We should remember that this was only a few decades after the circulation of lynching postcards in US society, right? These were mementos of racial violence. They were images of racial threat. And they'd only been banned in the US in the early 20th century and likely still circulated in parts of the US at the time in which Emmett Till's image circulated as well, right? These images of violence against Black people, these lynching photographs, were incitements to violence. They circulated in the white community as evidence of white supremacy. And I raise this point because it shows how powerful the force of circulating one's own image, of claiming the corpse as one's kin, was for Black audiences, right? And it shows us that these images of violence against Black bodies are very, very far from guaranteeing solicitations of sympathy or calls to action or rage. In fact, white audiences historically were invited to see images of violence as symbols of white community and symbols of solidarity. And this will be important when we think about the contemporary moment and the responsibility of people like me who are racialized white that we have towards images of violence, right? Because this history informs what it means to look as a white subject today, right? My second historical instance, is the footage of the Rodney King beating. Elizabeth Alexander, who I'll turn to again next to talk about cell phone footage of police violence, wrote a really important article in 1994 called "Can You Be Black and Look at This?" And this is an article that I've put in the resources as well, that's about the force of the footage of the beatings of Rodney King by the LA police in 1991. We have to remember that this was a time before social media, right? Where the video footage played over and over and over again on national television for a mainstream American audience. It was very often framed through a court TV case where the footage was slowed down, sped up, sliced, interpreted with adjectives for King like buffed out or probable ex-con, lashing out like a wounded animal or combative, right? And Alexander explains that for BIPOC audiences, this footage, in her terms, came to reside in the flesh as forms of memory reactivated and articulated at moments of collective spectatorship. She said the white authored national narrative about King, the one that played on TV, contradicted the histories their bodies knew, right? Alexander raises the point that while sympathetic white colleagues said they too were nauseated and traumatized by watching the beatings, in doing so, they were exempting themselves from the category of the oppressor through this kind of parasympathetic response. And Alexander emphasizes that this should not erase the fact that traumatized Black viewers were uniquely taught what Alexander calls, and this is a quote from her, a sorry lesson of their continual physical vulnerability in the United States. And rather than reproduce the images of the Rodney King beating, what I'm reproducing here are two images from the Whitney Biennial of 1993, which is a major art exhibition in the US. It was also called the Race Biennial, and it was a space where a lot of artists of color were making provocations about the racial politics in the 1990s in the US. And the Rodney King footage was actually displayed in the space of the exhibit at the Whitney Museum alongside other works, including these two, Daniel Joseph Martinez's museum tags, which are those tags that you pin to your clothes when you enter into a museum to show that you've paid, but they all break down and say the statement, "I can't imagine ever wanting to be white." And David Hammond's "How Do You Like Me Now?", a picture of a white Jesse Jackson that was also included in the Whitney Biennial at that time. So it really shows the ways in which the Rodney King video became part of the public imaginary and part of the racial politics of the early 1990s. So I want to return to this twin predicament of Elizabeth Alexander and Ellen Scott, the idea that these images are epic and iconic instances of police violence and a medium of dissent, remembrance, intentional history, both at once, right? Elizabeth Alexander has recently written more about the images of police violence that have emerged in the contemporary moment. And she wrote an article in the New Yorker called "The Trayvon Generation." And she says, Black bodies in pain for public consumption have been an American national spectacle for centuries in one way or another, Black people also have been looking, forging a traumatized collective historical memory, which is reinvoked at contemporary sites of conflict. There's an amazing interview between Salamisha Tillett and Elizabeth Alexander in the New York Times this past June. And it really highlights the cost of watching and recording police violence for Black communities. And I think it's something that we all really need to pay attention to and think about, that these images don't emerge out of the ether, that they emerge out of bystander witnesses who are very often part of the same communities that are subject to this violence. When they're talking about Darnella Frazier, who's the 17-year-old girl whose phone recordings of George Floyd went viral and reignited Black Lives Matter movement, she says, mainly, I worried about Fraser and how her fate as an African-American girl was forever tethered to those 8 minutes and 46 seconds. She not only captured his death, but actively rejected the attempts that sought to cover up the police brutality. And Alexander says, I can't imagine that proximity. And she keeps filming. A question and a concern that we must ask is, who has this child? Alexander calls the people from Darnella Frazier's generation the Trayvon generation. She says they watched these violations up close and on their cell phones so many times over. They watched them in near real time. They watched them crisscrossed and concentrated. They watched them on the school bus. They watched them under the covers at night. They watched them often outside of the presence of adults who loved them and were charged with keeping them safe in body and soul. So I think it's clear that Black viewers understand this. They understand the cost and the compromise and the history and the trauma of these images existing. But I think white viewers not only pay insufficient attention to the cost of having these images of violence circulating, but to our complicity in the violence of looking and the violence of the right we've had historically to look. Elizabeth Alexander says with George Floyd's murder, it played on television 5,000 times. So back to the question of who's watching and what happens when Black people watch. To inform is one thing, to bear witness is another thing, but just to roll the video without a moment that says a life was taken here, a person was dehumanized here in this way that Black people have been dehumanized throughout our history. Seeing is important and helps you understand. But I think the repetition of that image without thought to who's watching it and how it affects them is something that we could work on a bit. These are the two quotes by Salamisha Tillett and Elizabeth Alexander. I'm worried about Fraser and how her fate as an African-American girl was forever tethered to those 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And who has this child? So I raised the question, what's the difference here? I cover this to highlight, for those of us who don't live the footage of police violence in our bodies in the same way as those who have been, in Alexander's words, taught the sorry lesson of their continued physical vulnerability in North America and beyond. For those of us who don't live this footage in this way, we have to think about the cost and the potency of this footage. And we have to think as well about the differential right to be protected from images of violence. In other words, the right for some to be protected from images of violence to their community and for others not to be protected, right? So what you see in this slide are two common strategies for representing violent death in the news. On the left is the footage of the killing of George Floyd, which is foregrounded by a warning, right? This video includes scenes of graphic violence and yet shows those images. And on the right is an image from the New York Times and an image from The Guardian, both of which deal with the killing of American contractors in Fallujah, neither of which decided to show any of the footage of those American soldiers, right? They didn't actually allow people to make the choice about whether they were going to view them or not. They simply withdrew them. because the editors acknowledge that choice might not be a sufficient mechanism for assessing the costs of images of violence. So we need to think about a few things in relationship to all of this. And these are the key questions that I ask out of this history and out of our contemporary moment where we're thinking about images of police violence. And the first is, how does media of police violence against BIPOC bodies circulate differently than for white bodies? Two is, how can we establish a right to not see that media? And three is, how can seeing or watching be part of a larger commitment to anti-racism? And I'm going to deal with each of these questions in turn by pointing to different resources and readings and arguments that help us to parse this. So for the first question about how does media of police violence circulate differently for Black and for white bodies, I really rely on the work of Safiya Noble. Her book, Algorithms of Oppression, I can't recommend it enough. It's so amazing. She highlights how algorithms reinforce oppressive social relationships through a process that she calls technological redlining. Right. And so in an article specifically on Black death and dying online, she argues that videos of Black death circulate in these multinational media platforms as a kind of commercial property, right? A kind of commercial property that works in the service of the consolidation of power, even as it raises consciousness and awareness for the lack of justice for Black people in North America. And so she says, and this is from the article that I've cited in the resources, while certain types of objectionable material is filtered out of view by software or human beings, images of African Americans dead and dying are often the titillating object of persistent media spectacle. And such material is hyper-circulated and often goes viral through online media platforms. What we need is a framework to contextualize how social media fosters symbolic death and post-traumatic stress, right? We need to understand this differential circulation of the images and the footage of violence against certain bodies because of the threat that such images make to people who are watching them, right? And the persistent vulnerability that's the message given from those images themselves. She says that viral videos work as kinds of surveillance technologies and that they're rooted in this kind of emancipatory logic that information must be free, right? That we must have the right to see and the right to circulate. And she says those rights to see and to circulate are, in her terms, over-afforded to white Americans, right? So Ellen Scott argues that images of police violence and killings can be made to serve various kinds of spectatorship. They can fuel a culture that's often excited by violent action spectacles. Or on the other hand, they may be used to motivate civil rights activism and prove government wrongs. And we need to again think both this incidence of violence and this potential of the media itself. So that's the first point that I was raising. The second question is really about the right not to see, the right not to see a set of images. I'm just going to move my screen so that you can see the quote. There's an amazing article by Nehal El-Hadi called Death Undone, and that's also in the resources. And she begins this really powerful account with an experience of scrolling through her Twitter feed on July 6th, 2016, when the footage of Philando Castile's murder started playing automatically. And this is because on June 16th, 2015, Twitter introduced a new feature called autoplay. When a user scrolls through their timeline and sees a video, that content will begin to automatically play while muted. And if you click on the video, it'll bring the user into a full screen view with sound and continue playing. So El-Hadi, who was sitting at her desk in Toronto, unwittingly entered into the space of Philando Castile's death. And she says, as a journalist, I think about this, the impulse to bear witness in order to produce testimony. But I don't need to press play and watch death to feel what it means in my own Black body. Before I could figure out what I was seeing, I was watching a man's dying moments. I didn't want to watch Castile's death or any of the other deaths on film. And she uses this as a launch point to reflect on these new technologies that bring Black death to one's social media feed. Cell phone cameras, social media networks, dashboard cams, body cams, all of these other technologies, she says, are actually incriminated in racist acts of violence towards Black bodies, right? And these technologies have failed to result in safety for Black people. Instead, she draws on this powerful quote by the Black audio collective filmmaker John Akomfra about the digitopic, which is the digital and the utopic, right? Moments when demands for the impossible become the harbingers of new modes, new relations, new systems for manufacturing and accelerating the indexical implications of the moving image. And the examples that El-Hadi gives for this digitopic moment, for this digitopia that might assert the right not to see, designs to blank out or remove images of dead Black bodies automatically, or prevent the digital manipulation of images of Black bodies. Bots designed to limit the replication and distribution of Black bodies without the consent of the victim's family. So remember, when I was talking about Emmett Till, the circulation of the image of Emmett Till was sanctioned by his mother and claimed by his community, right? There's a really big difference between that and an image that circulates loosely through the free flow of information on social media. Perhaps browser extensions that can sense death and add another layer of complexity to the autoplay feature settings, right? That these are all possibilities for thinking about how we might do media activism to reduce the impact and the trauma of images of police violence while still using the potency of those forms of evidence without forcing people to watch them or to see them. And the next slide that I'm going to show is potentially, I just want to give a trigger warning to it. It's an art piece by Pat Ward-Williams that includes a picture of a lynching. And so I want to say that before I show it. And I use this to try and talk about what watching or not watching might mean as a commitment to anti-racism. And I call this watching, not watching, or somebody do something. Right. This is a really powerful artwork by Pat Ward-Williams called Accused Blowtorch Padlock. And it's an image that she took with a series of photographs that were reproduced in Life magazine. And she looks at the picture and can't bear to think about the conditions of the production of those images. And so she scrawls across in a kind of chalkboard like it's a lesson. Can you be Black and look at this without fear? And that's the title of the Elizabeth Alexander piece about the Rodney King video, right? Who was the photographer? Who took this picture? Could he just as easily have let the man go? Who took this picture? How can this photograph exist? Somebody do something. Elizabeth Alexander says that Pat Ward-Williams asked not just how did this happen, but what did it mean for a white person to watch it and to record it and to not try and be helpful? So what I'm suggesting, and this is my third point, as a white viewer thinking about the position of white viewership, is that we must respond to the hope that these instances of violence can pierce a hole in white fantasies that we live in a post-racial society. It means we need to move beyond sadness, and we need to move even beyond outrage towards a real commitment to Black Lives Mattering. How do we do this? I really rely a lot on the work of Ariella Azoulay, and she has a really potent book called The Civil Contract of Photography. And she sees the image as the site of a contract between co-citizens, the people who record them, the people who watch them, and the people who are figured in them. And she says that the civil contract is not about seeing these images as a space of empathy or of shame or of pity or of compassion, but as a space of responsibility and a space of obligation. It's a space where you have to declare that those who are figured in the image or in the footage are citizens, and so am I. So what do we have to do about it? Here are some of the questions she asks. that she's suggesting that we might ask ourselves when we're asking how we might watch footage or how we might watch photographs. And she says we shouldn't look at them. We should watch them. We should pay attention to them. And we should ask ourselves, who's looking out of the photograph? And why are they looking at me? And were they really seeking to look at me or someone else? And why, right? In other words, who is the image for? What does it mean for me to be looking at it? Number two, what are they demanding? How can I read their consent to be photographed? What happens if consent was impossible? This may come from a bystander witness. This may come from the person themselves. What does it mean for this footage to exist, right? It's an important question we have to ask. What are the costs of this footage existing? What can I reconstruct about the event depicted in the photograph? In other words, how can I watch it rather than look at it? Do I get the full picture? Do I understand the context in which the events that unfold in the footage are possible? What happens to my position, to my citizenship, when confronted with their catastrophe, their increased vulnerability to catastrophe? How do they become a citizen in my eyes? I think this is such an important question. This is so key for me. It means both recognizing the co-equality of me as a viewer and the person figured there. It means that their humanity is on an equal plane to mine. And it means understanding how BIPOC folks are regularly stripped of their citizenship rights, even as I look on, right? So 6, how might I redistribute power between the person figured in the image, the photographer, and myself as a spectator? What do I do to put myself on the line for those whose vulnerability is exposed to me here? How can I sustain protest and civil rights activism, making those movements more possible and more effective by the sheer numbers of bodies in the streets? And I want to end here by saying this is fundamentally the challenge of images of violence against BIPOC people. We need to acknowledge that their circulation is traumatic and potentially potent, if and only if those images are claimed by those whose vulnerability has been exposed. And I just want to end by really thanking Jamila and the Anti-Racist Pedagogy Project for this really outstanding work and these modules. And I'm really grateful and honored to contribute to the project.